Thank you all. I'm really glad to be here to have the opportunity to share with you all this week and next week. Pastor Mike offered me 2 weeks. When I said I was going to teach Balaam, he immediately said, "Do you want 2 weeks?" I said, "Yes, that would be fantastic. Thank you." So this week we're going to be doing Numbers chapter 22. The story of Balaam is famous because of the donkey episode. Right? If anybody knows Balaam, it's usually because, I think earlier tonight someone said, the magic donkey. Yeah, that's right. That's why everybody knows Balaam. Balaam and the talking donkey. But the significance, practically, prophetically, and theologically, of the Balaam story goes far beyond the talking donkey. The story of Balaam is one of prophetic patterns, spiritual warfare, and the faithfulness of God. So chapter 22 really, the reason I want to go verse by verse through chapter 22, because otherwise we could just skip right into the prophecy part of Balaam, is because the scholarship that I've read on this makes the point that in order to really understand what is being communicated fully in those prophetic chapters 23 and 24, we really need to understand what exactly the author of Numbers is trying to communicate through this donkey episode. Right? What's the point of the talking donkey? So for the context, before we jump into chapter 22, we're going to read a few verses in Numbers chapter 21. And we are going to begin in Numbers 21, verse 21. And we're just going to go with, they got that bad boy up there, so we're ready to go. So I'll read that for you. Then Israel sent messengers to Sihon, king of the Amorites, saying, "Let me pass through your land. We will not turn off into field or vineyard. We will not drink water from wells. We will go by the king's highway until we have passed through your border." But Sihon would not permit Israel to pass through his border. So Sihon gathered all his people and went out against Israel in the wilderness and came to Jahaz and fought against Israel. Then Israel struck him with the edge of the sword and took possession of his land from the Arnon to the Jabbok, as far as the sons of Ammon, for the border of the sons of Ammon was Jazer. Then we're going to skip to verse 33. It says, "Then they turned and went up by the way of Bashan, and Og, the king of Bashan, went out with all his people for battle at Edrei. But the Lord said to Moses, 'Do not fear him, for I have given him into your hand, and all his people and his land. And you shall do to him as you did to Sihon, king of the Amorites, who lived at Heshbon.' So they killed him and his sons and all his people until there was no remnant left him, and they possessed his land." And that brings us to chapter 21, verse 1. I'm sorry, 22, verse 1. Yes, thank you. 22, verse 1. "Then the sons of Israel journeyed and camped in the plains of Moab, beyond the Jordan opposite Jericho." So as we just read, at the end of chapter 21, Israel had defeated Og, the king of Bashan, who was the last of the remnant of the Rephaim, according to Deuteronomy 3:11. So he was the last one of these Rephaim, these main giants. And after this great victory, Israel will now face 2 great threats in the next 4 chapters. And this is often how life goes. Spiritual victories are often followed closely by serious spiritual battles. And that's what we're going to see here with the children of Israel and Balaam. And N.T. Wright has said, quote, "The reward for climbing one moral mountain is to be given a steeper one next time. Those in Christian leadership particularly need to be clear on that," end quote. So it's easy when we do some of these Old Testament readings, right? Oh, look, it's a story about a donkey. What does that have to do with me? Probably nothing. Let me just keep going. But we can see these patterns and we can see these lessons. Okay, Israel had battles, and then they had peace, and then they had battles. So we can see these patterns in our own lives. And specifically with Israel, in chapters 22 through 24, they're going to be facing the sorcery of Balaam. And then in chapter 25, they're going to be facing the spiritual and physical seduction by the women of Moab and the Baal of Peor, which will end with them being judged. We're not going to be getting into those chapters, but if you just keep reading Numbers 25, that's what ends up happening. So the 2 ploys that we're going to see King Balak adopt in order to try to defeat Israel is aggression and seduction. These two form Moab's response to Israel's encampment. And aggression and seduction are still the response of the powers of darkness to the people of God today. We see this same thing actually in the letters to the churches in Revelation. We can pick up this same pattern. So the aggression that the church in the letter to Smyrna faced, they faced severe physical persecution, that church. That letter is followed by the letter to Pergamos, which actually mentions Balaam by name. And after that is the letter to Thyatira, which warns against the seduction of Jezebel. So again, we see this pattern: physical aggression, spiritual aggression, and seduction. So it carries on through into Revelation. So now we'll pick up and read a few more verses in chapter 22, starting at verse 2. Now Balak the son of Zippor saw all that Israel had done to the Amorites. So Moab was in great fear because of the people, for they were numerous. And Moab was in dread of the sons of Israel. Moab said to the elders of Midian, "Now this horde will lick up all that is around us, as the ox licks up the grass of the field." And Balak the son of Zippor was king of Moab at that time. So he sent messengers to Balaam, the son of Beor at Pethor, which is near the river, in the land of the sons of his people, to call him, saying, "Behold, a people came out of Egypt. Behold, they cover the surface of the land, and they are living opposite me. Now, therefore, please come curse this people for me, since they are too mighty for me. Perhaps I may be able to defeat them and drive them out of the land. For I know that he whom you bless is blessed, and he whom you curse is cursed." So as I mentioned, military aggression is what Sihon and Og had tried. That failed. They were thoroughly defeated. So Balak is recognizing that physical weapons are not going to work against this war that he foresees with Israel. So Balak sought to employ supernatural aggression. And a scholar named Calvin Seerveld has a great quote here, so I'm just going to read, not try to paraphrase it, but he says, quote, "There was something uncanny, supernatural, existence-threatening about this special folk Israel with an almighty God. Total victory over the Amorites and Og. Weaponry you could touch would not be strong enough for preserving Moab's land, life, and possessions. Demonic powers would be needed, aid from the spirit world, an effective curse to break the spell of these Hebraic invaders from the wilderness," end quote. So that's why he wants to get Balaam. He wants to get Balaam to invoke these powers, to lay a curse, so that he can win in war. And there's also, in the Hebrew, there's the author of Numbers here is very skilled linguistically. He makes all kinds of connections with what's gone before in the Torah, in the history of Israel. So I'll be pointing out a few of those as we go, and there's one in these section of verses here, and that's paralleling Balak and the Moabites' reaction to the reaction of Pharaoh and the Egyptians. And the author of Numbers, Moses, he intended his audience to think back to the Exodus. Balak is portrayed as something of a Pharaoh reborn, and the threat posed by Pharaoh and his magicians. If you remember, Pharaoh also had occult magicians that could, up to a point, mimic the things that Moses was doing. So Pharaoh and his magicians are paralleled here by Balak and Balaam. That's what the Hebrew is connecting those. So again, it's interesting too that one of the commentaries I read, he actually has a quote from a scholar from the 1880s who saw these same things. So this isn't like a new idea, like, oh look, let's think of it this way. But this scholar in the 1880s, he pointed out that because of the desperation of Moab, the supernal or infernal powers, or both, must be invoked, and if possible, at whatever cost, enlisted in their behalf. The most prevailing of the diviners must be obtained to bring down calamity and ruin on the victorious host. So there's some little bit of scholar speak in there. The word supernal just means celestial, and infernal means underworld. So they're willing to call on whoever they have to call on to help them win. That's really what we're supposed to be understanding here from the mindset of Balak. And so that famous diviner that he's going to call for is Balaam, the son of Beor. The name Balaam means destroyer of the people, and Beor means destruction. So they're calling for the destroyer of the people, a son of destruction, to come to curse Israel. So there's another linguistic connection here to Egypt, and that's in, if we can go back to verse 5. So in the translation we have on the screen there, it says they cover the surface of the land. The Hebrew literally says they cover the eye of the land. And this is an early hint of one of the themes of the entire Balaam narrative, and that's the motif of seeing. So as we go forward, we're going to notice who sees and when they see and who gives them the sight. So this is hinted at right here in the Hebrew, that Balak is concerned that the people are going to cover the eye of the land. And Balak's closing phrase, if we can put verse 6 back up real quick, please. I know that he whom you bless is blessed, and he whom you curse is cursed. What does that sound like? That sounds exactly like the Lord's promise to Abram in chapter 12, verse 3. The Lord told Abram, I will bless those who bless you, and the one who curses you I will curse. So the author here is sort of lifting Balak up as an opposer to the Lord himself. That Balak is seeking to nullify God's covenant promise to Abraham and Israel. And through Balak's own lips, Balaam is being set up as this opposing force. Balak says that Balaam wields the same power in blessing and cursing as God himself. So it's really they're really setting it up here as sort of like a supernatural battle. Who has the power? So Balak, quote unquote, knows the effectiveness and surety of Balaam's ability to curse, but he does not know the surety of the Lord's promises. And this again is portraying Balak as Pharaoh. Because in Exodus 5 verse 2 we read, but Pharaoh said, who is the Lord that I should obey his voice and let Israel go? I do not know the Lord, and moreover I will not let Israel go. So as Pharaoh learned, Balak and Balaam are about to learn where the true power lies and whose promises can be trusted. So if we can go to verse 7. So the elders of Moab and the elders of Midian departed with the fees for divination in their hand, and they came to Balaam and repeated Balak's words to him. So this next section, I mean, honestly, we could skip, but I'm kind of a nerd for like, okay, what does that really mean? So if you see there the phrase, the fees for divination in their hand, that's questionable. The scholars argue about what does that really mean. Now, most translations do say the fee for divination. But it's also pointed out that Balaam wasn't going to be paid until the job was done. So some scholars question whether or not they would have actually taken any fees with them at that time, because he needed to earn it before he's going to be paid. So there's another translation called the NABRE, the New American Bible Revised, and they translate that verse as, so the elders of Moab and the elders of Midian, themselves experts in divination, left and went to Balaam. And they point out that the literal Hebrew says divination was in their hand. And they translate that as in their possession, like they themselves were experts. So Balak would be sending Balaam fellow experts in this spiritual warfare area to try to recruit him. And that is the view that the New Jerusalem Publication Translation, the New JPS, that's the translation they prefer. And this interpretation is also adopted by the renowned Hebrew scholar Jacob Milgram. And I think that actually makes sense. There's one other option that also makes good sense of this. And that is that the literal Hebrew reading in their hands implies something portable, like they took something with them. So in this view, the phrase probably means that they took the tools of divination with them. And this would be something similar to the kinds of objects that are depicted in Ezekiel 21:21, when Ezekiel's prophesying about the king of Babylon. It says, for the king of Babylon stands at the parting of the way, at the head of the two ways, to use divination. He shakes the arrows, he consults the teraphim, he looks at the liver. So some try to link what these people were taking to Balaam with that. So whether Balaam would or even need these objects is beside the point. This is what Balak thought would be necessary to get the job done. So that's just maybe a little bit of like more nerdy stuff about what's going on here in the background of the passage. So verse 8, if we could put verse 8 and 9. So this is Balaam speaking here. He said to them, "Spend the night here, and I will bring word back to you as the Lord may speak to me." And the leaders of Moab stayed with Balaam. Then God came to Balaam and said, "Who are these men with you?" So Balaam, it seems like Balaam, if you notice there, he says, "I will return you word just as the Lord." That's the covenant, that's Yahweh. So Balaam knows the name of Israel's God. So it could be that since Balaam was from Pethor of Aram in upper Mesopotamia, which is 360 miles from Moab, we wonder, how did he know the name of Israel's God? Well, it could be, and it seems possible, that Balaam's familiarity with the Lord is through Israel's Aramean relatives. If you remember when Jacob fled from Esau, he went up to that area, and he interacted with those people for a number of years. And so the Aramean relatives would be the family of Laban, Jacob's uncle Laban. And if that's true, it may explain why Balaam's view of the Lord is rather skewed, as we'll find out. Because Jacob's uncle Laban was not known for his theological accuracy. He was a squirrely guy. So if this is where Balaam learned about the Lord, it would follow that this is why Balaam himself is a squirrely guy. We also notice here that God came to Balaam at night, and this seems to be what Balaam was expecting. He tells the elders to spend the night, and I'll come back to you in the morning and give you the Lord's answer, implying that Balaam expected to receive the answer during the night. So this is another pattern that we see repeated throughout Genesis. Genesis 20 verse 3 says, "But God came to Abimelech in a dream of the night and said to him." So there we see God appearing to this pagan king at night. And then Genesis 31:24, actually God appears to, or comes to speak with Jacob's uncle Laban at night. God came to Laban the Aramean in a dream of the night and said to him. So this idea of God appearing at night, he visits the pagan at night, warning them of their current or desired course. So God's warning, he's warning, in the first one he was warning Abimelech, and the second one he's warning Laban, and here he's warning Balaam. So this is another theme, another pattern that we see. God's appearing to these non-Israelites, these what you'd call these pagans at night to communicate with them. So verse 10, Balaam said to God, "Balak, the son of Zippor, king of Moab, has sent word to me. Behold, there is a people who came out of Egypt, and they cover the surface of the land. Now come, curse them for me. Perhaps I may be able to fight against them and drive them out." So the literal Hebrew here, Balaam actually changes Balak's words. He softens what Balak actually said. So Balak calls Balaam, he said, "Come and curse." The Hebrew word that Balaam reports to the Lord is a softer term. It's more of a condemn. So come and condemn them. And he changes Balak's strike them down, Balaam softens that to battle. So it's almost as if Balaam is already starting, Balaam, this master manipulator, this master soothsayer, he's trying to soften the words of Balak in hopes that God will let him go. He's already trying to kind of manipulate God. And Balaam, if you notice, he also omits entirely Balak's confidence in Balaam's own ability to bless or curse. He doesn't even mention that. Hey, this guy says I have the power to do this. He doesn't bring that to God. He just says he wants me to come and condemn, softening it. So verse 12. God said to Balaam, "Do not go with them. You shall not curse the people, for they are blessed." Now, those of you who are familiar with the Jewish interpretation or the rabbinic writings, they have a lot of commentary on the Torah. The rabbis really spilled a lot of ink on that. And there's a writing that's known as Numbers Rabbah, and that's a Jewish commentary, and they actually expand this conversation, a little bit of imaginative interpretation, which the rabbis are kind of famous for imaginatively reinterpreting things. So they have this conversation between Balaam and God. It goes something like, God said to Balaam, "You shall not go with them." Well then, says Balaam, I will curse them from here. God responds, you shall not curse the people. In that case, says Balaam, let me bless them. God, they do not need your blessing, for they are blessed. So I think that captures kind of the interaction there between God and Balaam. So verse 13. So Balaam arose in the morning and said to Balak's leaders, go back to your land, for the Lord has refused to let me go with you. The leaders of Moab arose and went to Balak and said, Balaam refused to come with us. So if we'll notice, the Lord told Balaam three things. He told Balaam, you will not go, you will not curse, they are blessed. So we see Balaam is already proving dishonest. He told the elders that he would return word just as the Lord speaks, but he did not do that. He just said, basically, the Lord refused to let me come. He didn't give them the word of God. He wasn't faithful as a prophet to speak what God gave him to speak. Verse 15, then Balak again sent leaders, more numerous and more distinguished than the former. They came to Balaam and said to him, thus says Balak, the son of Zippor, let nothing, I beg you, hinder you from coming to me. For I will indeed honor you richly, and I will do whatever you say to me. Please come then, curse this people for me. So they're negotiating. And we'll see in a minute why Balak, he didn't take what Balaam said literal. He didn't think that's really what Balaam meant. But if we could put verse 16, I think it is 16. Yes. So if you notice there, thus says Balak. For those of us familiar with the Old Testament prophets, that might trigger a thought. Thus says the Lord is a common expression throughout the Old Testament. That's how God speaks to the prophets. So Balak, or the author of Numbers at least, is wanting us to see that Balak is now asserting himself with the authority of a God. Thus says Balak, in opposition to thus says the Lord. This is also the language used in the Lord's confrontation with Pharaoh. Moses would go and he would say, thus says the Lord, let my people go. So the thus says is Balak challenging the word and authority of God. The Lord told Balaam, you shall not go. Balak tells Balaam, come. The Lord said, you shall not curse them. Balak says, come and condemn them. And Balaam is caught in the middle, seeking to serve two masters. Now we could say that it's Yahweh or it's the Lord and Balak that Balaam is caught between, but that's really not what it is. Balaam is caught between the Lord and Mammon. Balaam wants to get paid. And this sounds like something Jesus taught against repeatedly. No one can serve two masters. Further, he will hate the one and love the other, or he will be devoted to one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and wealth. And Balaam here is trying to walk that line, but he really wants the wealth. Verse 18. Balaam replied to the servants of Balak, though Balak were to give me his house full of silver and gold, I could not do anything, either small or great, contrary to the command of the Lord my God. Now please, you also stay here tonight, and I will find out what else the Lord will speak to me. So many scholars agree that this is a negotiating tactic by Balaam, designed to elicit the highest possible price for his services. It also suggests that Balaam didn't really mean what he said in verse 18, when he said, even if Balak were to give me his house full of silver and gold, then he goes on. But he already was given explicit instructions what he was supposed to do. But here he says, his pious sounding words, even if you were to give me all of the wealth in the world. But hold on, let me go make sure. Maybe God will change his mind. Balaam is succumbing to greed. And if we notice Balaam's exact words, he says, I could not, or I am not able. Another translation has it, I would be powerless to do anything contrary to the command of the Lord. It's not necessarily that he doesn't want to go against the Lord. He claims the inability. So this is foreshadowing the donkey already. We're already foreshadowing the donkey. And even with this nice-sounding statement by Balaam, he then goes to seek God to find out if he can get a different command than what he was already explicitly told. But Balak's increased offer doesn't change the will of God. The problem is not the will of God. The problem is the will of Balaam, who desires to cash the blank check. So verse 20. God came to Balaam at night and said to him, if the men have come to call you, rise up and go with them, but only the word which I speak to you shall you do. Now this verse and the following couple verses has caused a great amount of consternation in attempting to understand it. Why does God allow or directly tell Balaam to go when he had previously forbidden him? There's a lot of question about that. I think there are actually two really good answers to that. Actually, there's three. I just looked at my notes. I have three. So some scholars focus on the if in the Lord's answer. There's a scholar named Kaiser, and he's not the only one, but he's just the one that I see here. He and others read the conditional statement quite literally, that Balaam was to wait for the men to come and call him in the morning, but as we will see, instead of waiting, Balaam, being anxious to go, saddles his donkey and seeks the men out. So that's one way to understand it. I actually think I agree with that one. I think that's a good way to go. There's another possibility, and it's actually not contradictory to the other one. I think they build on each other, and they're all part of the answer here. Another option is to see God's words as not simply to be taken as straightforward permission to go, any more than Balaam's pious-sounding words in verse 18 are taken at their face value as expressing obedience. Or as Balak himself didn't take Balaam's initial words of refusal at face value. We're negotiating here. We're playing the game. Now, God tells Balaam the very thing that Balaam wants to hear, but it will not mean for Balaam what he may think it will mean. God's response here and his desire is to seek to teach Balaam a lesson. And it's this lesson that's the subject of the donkey episode. The highly esteemed and expensive seer can see less than a proverbially dumb animal. As we'll see, Balaam's interaction with the donkey focuses on discernment, the ability to see and understand what is going on, especially in relation to God. Specifically, how can the man, Balaam, who cannot interpret the obvious actions of his donkey, interpret the more difficult the more difficult action of God? Balaam's failure to carry out even the simplest exercise of discernment is manifest. Balaam's greed has made him blind and foolish. God was aware of Balaam's covetous intent. As Psalm 18:26 says, you are pure toward the pure, but toward the crooked you are tricky. So this is God, again, seeking to teach Balaam a lesson. And the rabbis, again, also have a very helpful statement here. The rabbis said that, they made it simple. Why did God tell Balaam to go? Because Balaam was already bent on going. And then they have a little proverb. They say, in the direction a man is determined to walk, heaven lets him go. So I think if we put all those together, it explains why it seems like there's a contradiction in what God is saying there. It's not really contradictory. As we'll see, there's even more about this conditional if as we go here that Balaam doesn't meet. So I think all those explain that problem that some people have with that, with verse 20 and 22. So verse 21, so Balaam arose in the morning and saddled his donkey and went with the leaders of Moab. So they're very strong. It's not identical in the Hebrew, but it's very similar here in Genesis 22:3, which says, so Abraham rose early in the morning, saddled his donkey. The Jewish interpretation notices the parallel between Abraham and Balaam as men of wealth and status. Both were very wealthy, and both were very highly regarded in their culture. And they both had servants for such menial labor as donkey saddling. And the rabbis, or the Jewish interpreters, saw the personal saddling of the donkeys by both Abraham and Balaam as a display of their zeal for the journey. Abraham was so committed to obedience, even at the risk of great personal loss, that he saddled his own donkey. Balaam, contrast, is so eager to set out and curse Israel against the expressed will of God that he too saddles his own donkey. Abraham's obedience led to the Lord's confirmed promise to bless Israel. So Balaam obviously doesn't know this, but Abraham's previous journey of obedience had already nullified and counteracted the journey that Balaam is currently undertaking. Balaam was defeated before he even started because of God's promise due to the faithfulness of Abraham. The Jewish commentators have said, "Let the saddling done by our father Abraham, in order to go and fulfill the will of him at whose word the world came into existence, counteract the saddling done by Balaam in order to go and curse Israel." So the rabbis themselves have linked Balaam and Abraham. Balaam is the anti-Abraham. And interestingly, the word curse occurs 7 times in the Balaam narrative, but the word bless occurs 14 times. The Lord's promise of blessing to Abraham far outweighs and overpowers Balak and Balaam's intentions to curse. While Balak may well have hired the anti-Abraham from the same place and supposedly possessing these same powers, Abraham was also called a prophet, if you remember, in certain places in Genesis. And they're seeking to reverse these divine promises of blessing granted to Abraham, but they are doomed to failure. Now, while contrasted with Abraham, the rabbis also, they compare and often identify Balaam with Jacob's greedy uncle Laban. So here comes Laban again. And the rabbis also seem to interpret Balaam as a sort of counter-hero to Moses. So they saw all these parallels between Israel's heroes and Israel's attackers. And they saw Balaam clearly on the opposite side of where he ought to be. Balaam is the villain, which is sad because he had the potential for greatness and is even used by God to give messianic prophecies, which we'll see next week. But Balaam was more committed to his own ambitions than to the Lord. We could perhaps also see Judas in this same mold. Judas, called to be an apostle by Christ himself. I'm sure Jesus had great desire for him to do amazing things, but Judas had his own ideas, his own thoughts about how things should be. And I would suggest we could also examine ourselves just to see, Paul said to examine ourselves. Are we more committed to God's ways or our ways? We could just examine. Verse 22, but God was angry because he was going, and there's Balaam. God was angry because Balaam was going, and the angel of the Lord took his stand in the way as an adversary against him. Now he was riding on his donkey, and his 2 servants were with him. Now there's an interesting and I believe significant detail to notice. Verse 21 said that Balaam went with the princes of Moab. When we get to verse 35, it will say that Balaam went with the princes of Balak. Now it's possible, and I myself, I lean towards this because I think it has good explanatory value. It's possible that there are 2 separate groups that Balak has sent in his attempt to lure Balaam into coming. As we saw, it said that Balak sent these elders and these princes, and he's sending a delegation to try to get Balaam, to try to entice Balaam. So if that's the case, then Balaam's journey here on his donkey with his 2 servant lads may be simply Balaam's traveling to join the rest of this Moabite caravan, which is identified as the princes of Balak. So this view would say that this other group had camped outside the town, and the angel stood in Balaam's way on his journey to meet these princes of Balak. And this scenario would further explain, I believe, verse 20 and 22, because it would imply that God's condition had not been met. When God said, if the men come to call you, go with them. But Balaam, under this scenario, is actually taking the initiative to go and find these princes of Balak. So as I said, I like that scenario because I think it has good explanatory power in linking basically the narrative interaction between God and Balaam up to now. So now we get finally to this donkey, verse 23 to 27. When the donkey saw the angel of the Lord standing in the way with his drawn sword in his hand, the donkey turned off the way and went into the field. But Balaam struck the donkey to turn her back into the way. Then the angel of the Lord stood in a narrow path of the vineyards with a wall on this side and a wall on that side. When the donkey saw the angel of the Lord, she pressed herself to the wall and pressed Balaam's foot against the wall, so he struck her again. The angel of the Lord went further and stood in a narrow place where there was no way to turn to the right hand or the left. When the donkey saw the angel of the Lord, she lay down under Balaam, so Balaam was angry and struck the donkey with his stick. So notice the increasing lack of freedom that Balaam has as this narrative unfolds. So we can see some spiritual truths here just in this Balaam trying to go forward. First, Balaam, well, not even Balaam, because he doesn't see anything at this point, but the donkey sees the angel in a field. So he showed the donkey. She still has some lateral mobility to take Balaam on one side or the other. But when Balaam continues in his disobedience, the angel then stands in a narrow path. The donkey can still get around, but it requires pain to keep going through, crushes Balaam's foot. And finally, the angel stands in a place that's so narrow that no lateral movement is possible. So the more we rebel and are blind to the ways of the Lord, the less free we truly are. Even if we, like Balaam, don't know it, because Balaam is totally ignorant of what he was up against here. Stubbornness and blindness limit the relative freedom that one has. Verse 28. The angel of the Lord went further. Verse 28. And the Lord opened the mouth of the donkey, and she said to Balaam, "What have I done to you that you have struck me these 3 times?" Then Balaam said to the donkey, "Because you have made a mockery of me, if there had been a sword in my hand, I would have killed you by now." The donkey said to Balaam, "Am I not your donkey on which you have ridden all your life to this day? Have I ever been accustomed to do so to you?" And he said, "No." Then the Lord opened the eyes of Balaam, and he saw the angel of the Lord standing in the way with his drawn sword in his hand, and he bowed all the way to the ground. So at last, Balaam, the famous diviner, this famous seer, finally has the same spiritual sight as the donkey. Verse 32. And the angel of the Lord said to him, "Why have you struck your donkey these 3 times? Behold, I have come out as an adversary because your way was contrary to me." So the final phrase here is another one that's a bit difficult to translate in the Hebrew, because your way was contrary. My favorite explanation is that put forward by a scholar named Moberly. And he suggests that this Hebrew phrase is a Hebrew idiom similar to our phrase slippery slope. So the angel, pointing out Balaam's blindness and injustice, is telling him he's on a slippery slope. Balaam is allowing his prophetic office to be corrupted by greed, a greed which has made him blind to the presence of the God in whose name he claims to speak. So verse 33. But the donkey saw me, this is still the angel speaking, but the donkey saw me and turned aside from me these 3 times. If she had not turned aside from me, I would surely have killed you just now and let her live. So Balaam wanted to kill the donkey, but it was Balaam himself who's actually under the death penalty. The donkey was righteous and Balaam is not. While Balaam threatened to kill her, it was he who had the sword hanging over his head. The donkey actually saved Balaam's life 3 times, is what is the truth of the matter. And the angel points this out to Balaam. And this further illustrates Balaam's true blindness. So again, our theme at the beginning of seeing, who sees and who doesn't. So after beating the donkey 3 times, Balaam's eyes are finally opened by the Lord, and he beholds the divine warrior, the angel of the Lord with the drawn sword, the same image that Joshua will later see, the same person. Joshua has this, he's in tune with the Lord, so he sees the angel right before the Battle of Jericho, and he says, he goes up and he worships when he finds out who it is. So at this point, Balaam's eyes are open and he beholds the divine warrior. Next week, we'll see that after seeking omens to curse Israel 3 times, Balaam's eyes will again be open and he will behold the divine Messiah. Chapter 24. So, verse 34, Balaam said to the angel of the Lord, I have sinned, for I did not know that you were standing in the way against me. Now then, if it is displeasing to you, I will turn back. But the angel of the Lord said to Balaam, go with the men, but you shall speak only the word which I tell you. So Balaam went along with the leaders of Balak. So at this point, Balaam he's given permission, but it's when he goes beyond the word of the Lord that Balaam will in fact then incur the death penalty. And just jumping ahead, that is actually what does end up happening. Numbers 31, it says that the Israelites put Balaam to death with the sword. So eventually he does transgress that word and he is executed. So here we've read this donkey episode. So you still might be thinking, what does that have to do with anything? Well, even though the story of the donkey is one of the strangest narratives in the Old Testament, it's actually vital to our understanding of the Balak-Balaam interaction that follows in chapters 22 and 23. The Balaam and donkey interaction prefigures the Balak and Balaam interaction. In this donkey episode, Balaam is blind to the spiritual reality, and he tries to force his donkey to go around the angel of the Lord 3 times. The donkey, who clearly has the spiritual upper hand, sees spiritual realities for what they are. After trying to force the donkey to go around the angel the 3rd time, God miraculously opens the donkey's mouth. Now, typically, a donkey is not reliable for spiritual guidance. But if God is the one who opens the donkey's mouth, its words become trustworthy and reliable. So similarly, when Balaam arrives to see Balak, Balak tries to force Balaam to curse Israel 3 times. And just as Balaam tried to force the donkey to go around the angel 3 times, Balak is trying to force Balaam to go beyond the word of the Lord 3 times. He's basically beating Balaam like he's a donkey, trying to get him to go where he wants him to go. In spite of Balak's pleas, Balaam blesses the people. And later in his exasperation, Balak's words to Balaam echo Balaam's earlier frustration with the donkey. Balak, like Balaam in the donkey narrative, blindly and perilously attempts to go against the Lord. And Balaam, like the donkey, supernaturally speaks the words that God will put in his mouth. Now, typically, the words of a pagan diviner are not reliable for spiritual guidance either. But if God is the one who puts these words in his mouth, those words become trustworthy and reliable. So in other words, Balaam will become God's donkey. That's what this donkey episode is supposed to prefigure. That the real donkey in the story is Balaam. And God will open the donkey's mouth to deliver spiritual truths to the blind Balak. That's the connection. The miracle of the talking donkey is indeed a supernatural wonder. But God using the mouth of Balaam to speak messianic prophecies is no less a wonder. And it is God who opened the mouth of both. And it's not only messianic prophecies that Balaam will utter in the role of God's donkey, it's actually also end-time prophecies. So you'll want to come back next week. So let me just finish up real quick here, just finish out the last couple verses here. 36, when Balak heard that Balaam was coming, he went out to meet him at the city of Moab, which is on the Arnon border at the extreme end of the border. Then Balak said to Balaam, did I not urgently send to you to call you? Why did you not come to me? Am I really unable to honor you? So Balaam said to Balak, behold, I have come now to you. Am I able to speak anything at all? The word that God puts in my mouth, that I shall speak. So Balaam's response here to Balak is as though he is already in the role of the donkey. Balaam asked, am I able to speak anything at all? That would be a donkey. A donkey is not able to speak anything at all. But the word that God puts in my mouth, that I shall speak. That's exactly what the donkey did. So Balaam here is, whether he knows it or not, he's basically signing up to be this donkey. And as I mentioned, next week, we'll look at the prophecies in Numbers chapter 24 that are uttered by God's donkey when the Spirit of God comes upon Balaam. So that is all I have for you guys tonight. I would like to close by reading, keeping with our theme being in Numbers. I don't think I told you about that, did I? Numbers chapter 6. Could you bring that up super fast? Just verse starting at 23. Would that be possible to put that up real quick? This is, again, our theme looking at this of blessing and cursing. The blessing, God actually gives Moses a blessing, and he tells Aaron, the high priest, to place this blessing upon my people. And it's Numbers chapter 6. If you could start with 23. So this is Moses. So the Lord tells Moses to tell Aaron, speak to Aaron and his sons, saying, thus shall you bless the sons of Israel. You shall say to them, the Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face shine on you and be gracious to you. The Lord lift up his countenance on you and give you peace. So they shall invoke my name on the sons of Israel, and I then will bless them.